Hiya, welcome. No music today. We're just getting right into the nitty-gritty of it. So now that we've covered quite a bit about monetary policy, or at least sort of the basics of monetary policy, there's a lot more to it that, we'll be able to understand once we understand dynamic macro models a little bit better. So that's going to be the goal for this section of the course. We're going to learn a little bit of dynamic macro modeling. Now, I've taught this in just about every single course that I have taught over the last, ever since I've been teaching. Sorry, I know it's kind of rude. It's like I had a burp when I'm up here talking. It's like, wow, he's disgusting. It's like, I know. I've taught this over the years with varying success, and the nice thing is having more variation in the amount of success that I get from teaching this, it allows me to extract a lot of information out of it, and I get to see what works and what doesn't work. So I'm going with what works, or at least what has worked so far. We will see if this works. Now, however, this is a conditional forecast of success, and therefore I am forward-looking, kind of like what Sumner and Beckworth talked about in that nominal GDP targeting video that I assigned. Yay! Basically what we're going to do now is we're going to get into understanding some of these dynamic macro models, because it's important to understand them so that we can see not just how monetary policy can affect, the price level or output if we're looking at the quantity theory of money, because there are other types of models out there, and there are a lot of models that, honestly, if you ask me, are better than what the quantity theory of money can provide. Quantity theory is a pretty good one, and it's an excellent kind of stepping stone, but I think we can go, it's like Kirk Cameron, surely we can do better than that. And, we can. And learning these dynamic macro models first teaches us the dynamic component of a lot of macroeconomic time series analysis, because it's all interlinked. It's linked through time. But we're also going to get an understanding of how this affects not just prices or output, but how it affects a bunch of other markets and how it affects all of them. I can't really say at once because sometimes there's a sequential ordering here, but how it affects all of them sort of together, right? Monetary policy is going to obviously affect bond markets. That's sort of the goal, because, the interest rate on these bonds is the sort of the goal of monetary policy. They want to be able to affect that first and then, allow it to transmit. Well, the way it transmits can really vary a lot. It can transmit through bank lending. It can transmit through portfolio rebalance effects. There's a bunch of different ways it can move. And the broader, I guess, of these general equilibrium models we can look at, the more we can sort of start to see what some of these transmission mechanisms of monetary policy are, right? How would monetary policy affect labor markets? How would it, if it affects labor markets, how would that lead to, a change in production? What would that mean for capital investment? Things like that. There's a lot that's going on with this, and these dynamic macro models can actually give us a good understanding of what's going on with it. These models that we're going to learn, they're really, really new. They started getting used in the 1980s after the Lucas critique. Well, all right, they're not super, well, I guess they're kind of new because they're older than I am. So I guess if I still say they're really, really new, then I don't sound super old. But they all came out after the Lucas critique. So you're probably going hey, Jeremy, what's the Lucas critique? Well, I will tell you. It was a set of papers that were published in the late 1970s, early 1980s that argued that the existing macro models out there were endogenous and therefore they weren't invariant to policy changes. Basically, these macro models could maybe explain how the economy would respond to a particular policy change at one point in time, but it was, quote, naive to try to predict the effects of a change in economic policy entirely on the basis of relationships observed in historical data, especially highly aggregated historical data. The models used reduced form analysis, which means they really only looked at raw correlations, and they didn't impose any structure based on any sort of economic theory to try to understand the relationships between certain macro variables because, output and price are going to be related to each other, right? And there's the supply and demand, right? If you change one, there's probably going to be at least a little bit of a response to another. We want to know what these things are. But if you're just looking at raw correlations, you're modeling just the evolution of the price level over time and just the evolution of real GDP over time, you're just looking at whether or not they're correlated. And it's like, well, of course they're correlated. But if you don't impose any structure on that based on economic theory, we'll kind of get into what this means later. But if you don't impose any of that structure on it, you can't get any causal inference. I'm sure you've probably heard correlation doesn't mean causation. Well, that's totally true. You need a little bit more to be able to get some sort of like a causal inference out of these things. So, since I, discussed that these things are kind of new and they came out under Lucas or after Lucas and all that, let's do a brief little history of macroeconomic thought. So before the Great Depression, the existing macroeconomic thought was basically supply-side economics. It came from like the works of Adam Smith, and there's multiple interpretations of supply-side economics. Many of them are wrong. The best one that I have yet to hear is that basically real economic activity is driven by supply-side factors. Now, we can make a case for that in the long run, and it's very, very difficult to argue against that, although people have. There's a video of me somewhere on the internet. I wouldn't bother looking for it because I don't think you can find it like with a Google search. I think it was like, maybe it was like a Facebook group or something. I don't know. But I got into it with this guy once. It was like some debate group thing I was in. This guy started trying to argue that long-run economic growth was driven by demand-side factors, so the government needs to, cause all sorts of economic growth. And I got really pissed. I got like really, really pissed. I think I swore at him a lot. So yeah, again, definitely don't try to find these videos because, well, I try to be somewhat professional. If you hear me, spitting out F words every couple of seconds, it's not going to be very good. And eventually I just got tired of the whole thing and just logged off because I was like, this guy isn't going to listen to any sort of reason. But long run, we can make this argument and it's pretty hard to argue against it. Short to medium run? Well, maybe it can be a little bit more susceptible to demand-side factors. And as the economy developed, got more complex, as we were able to collect better data, get better measurements for the economy, a lot of questions started to pop up as to whether or not demand-side economics played a role. Now, when it comes to supply-side economics, there's really not much of a role for government intervention. There's a much bigger role for government intervention when it comes to demand-side economics. Basically, the government can't do much to affect the supply-side factors of the economy, but they can affect the demand side. Really, the whole point of demand-side economics is to stabilize aggregate demand. It's not to stabilize aggregate supply. But since supply and demand are endogenous to each other, a change in demand could change supply, but it wouldn't directly affect supply. However, the existing macro theory was a little bit more focused on long-run growth at the time, prior to the Depression, and it had a very laissez-faire approach to business cycle mitigation because they were taking a lot of thought from long-run growth and development and trying to extrapolate that towards business cycle economics. And, well, there's some similarities, but not a lot. And, there had been attempts at more demand-side policy prior to the Depression, but the real, macroeconomic revolution arrived when John Maynard Keynes' general theory was published in 1936. And he was more focused on business cycle mitigation than long-run growth, and he even famously wrote once, quote, "In the long run, we are all dead," in response to whether or not he should be focused on long-run growth and development or business cycles. He was obviously a little bit more focused on business cycle mitigation. Basically, what he argued in this quote is that if we only focused on long-run growth, not to say it's not important, because it is, but if that's all we focused on, we could really screw ourselves with major fluctuations in the business cycle, which is more short to medium-run stuff. Therefore, he advocated using fiscal policy to mitigate some of these major swings in the business cycle, and the idea was to try to stabilize aggregate demand. what he did was, he looked at a lot of macroeconomic data and he noted that investment was extremely volatile. In terms of the components of GDP, investment was actually the most volatile component of GDP, and consumption was the most stable. So he argued that government spending could basically be used to offset some of these swings in investment to try to stabilize aggregate demand and prevent, major swings in the business cycle. So let's kind of look at some math here to see what exactly I'm talking about. From the national income accounting equation, right, GDP, Y equals C plus I plus G, we've got three components of GDP. We have consumption, which is C, investment, which is I, government spending, which is G. Now, consumption's really stable. And there's actually a whole lot of work on that, which we will be talking about in this course, not long from now, actually. Investment was super volatile. Therefore, government had a role for stabilization policy. As any change in any one of the components, right, anything on the right-hand side of equation 1 would alter GDP. If investment fell, government spending could rise to try to offset it. When it comes to talking about the volatility of investment, take a look at this right here. So what I've done is I have basically broken both consumption and investment down to percent changes over time. We can see that investment is extremely volatile, right? It's bouncing all over the place, right? Let's see, negative probably 17 or 18% drop in investment and as high as about a 21 or 22% increase in investment. When we look at consumption, though, I doubt any of these are even remotely close to 5%. So that tells us something kind of interesting. It says consumption is a really stable component and investment is really volatile. So why is investment as volatile as it is? Well, we can get to that in a second. Because Keynes argued since government spending was, a function of revenue, meaning like taxes or borrowing, and that the Great Depression was the result of slack demand, not really issues with supply, kind of right, kind of wrong. The government could have high taxes and spend very, very little when the economy's in a boom, right? Basically, when things are going well, you save. And the government would do the exact same thing. They would cut taxes and run deficits, however, and spend more to stabilize aggregate demand in a recession to prevent things from getting as bad as they would otherwise. So think of it as like the government having like a rainy day fund. They would collect that rainy day fund when the economy's doing well, and then when, it starts raining, well, guess what? Rainy day fund, here you go. And the idea would be that it would sort of stabilize some stuff. Yeah, the economy in the boom wouldn't be quite as large as it was because there's a lot of taxes removing that like productive capacity out of the economy. But on the other hand, when we enter a recession, the recession doesn't dip as low as it would otherwise. So basically it means that it could reduce unemployment, which, is as high as like 25%, I think, during the Great Depression, can provide financial stability. And he argued that the major swings in investment were the result of investors being spooked easily. He even dubbed the fact that these investors are easily spooked as, quote, animal spirits. That was his reason for why investment was as volatile as it was. And he wasn't super, super wrong about that. He's actually pretty right about that. And so Keynes's research at least partially advocated some initiatives, kind of like FDR's New Deal. Now, the New Deal was kind of a corrupt piece of garbage, but, I guess I need to keep some of my political views out of this here. But this type of policy, this school of economic thought, which later became known as the Keynesian School of Economic Thought, dominated economic research and policymaking for decades. It dominated monetary policy, which advocated for loose monetary policy to try to keep unemployment low at the cost of potentially higher inflation, right? Manipulation of the Phillips curve. Fiscal interventions, as well as monetary policy guided by the Phillips curve, led to some major problems in the U.S. economy over the next 40 years. It wasn't exactly all rosy. What's oftentimes referred to as the death of the Phillips curve was noted when there was high inflation and high unemployment in the 1970s, known as stagflation. And I got to say, it wasn't entirely the fault of the Fed. There were like negative supply shocks. that happened. There was like an oil price shock that occurred in the 70s. So it's not like, it was all the Fed's fault. The Fed didn't really cause that oil shock. But eventually it became apparent that this type of policy wasn't entirely effective, that the Keynesian school of thought wasn't an entirely effective policy or set of policy prescriptions to try to follow. Not to mention, aside from the fact that the policy wasn't working in real life, the macroeconomic models that were providing these policy implications weren't effective, nor were they feasible. Sometimes these models, like the econometric models, would have hundreds of reduced form equations to try and predict economic responses to policy interventions. I don't know about you, but I don't want to deal with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of equations. I've got better things to do with my life. For just example, my dissertation research, the main chapter of my dissertation had, I believe, either 6 or 7 equations in it, not hundreds. And these equations are all being run simultaneously. So, hundreds of simultaneous equations, I'm good. I'd rather 6 or 7. Thank God for DSGE stuff, or these dynamic macro models, because that kind of, allowed me to do things the way that I do. So yeah, on top of that, by being in reduced form, these equations that used historical data, like I said earlier in this presentation, didn't impose structure used to understand the causal relationships between certain variables. If we think back to the quantity theory of money, right, where some people were criticizing it, changes to different variables could affect the equation differently than others, and a lot of it would be because some of these variables in the quantity theory of money are technically left-hand side variables of other equations. There are data generating processes for these things which aren't being captured. So if we're not including that in the quantity theory of money, we can have some problems. Thank God Robert Lucas came along, and in a series of papers identified basically what he argued was the reason why these models were so ineffective. He argued they were endogenous, which meant that they weren't invariant to policy changes. They couldn't be used to predict responses to economic shocks. Now, I just want to go ahead and state there's nothing wrong with using historical data because that's all we have, right? We don't have data from the future. I mean, it'd be great if we did. Get in a DeLorean, go 88 miles an hour and go a couple quarters into the future, see what's going to happen. But, even then, we're not really predicting anything anymore because we already know what's going to happen, right? So, yeah, I mean, historical data is literally all that we have. But where this does go wrong, though, is with using that data, if we aren't imposing economic theory to explain how they interact, well, we're introducing a lot of problems into our analysis. So that's kind of where these things start to go wrong. It's where these models started to break down. Now, consider just, as a nice little example here, the following set of variables, and each variable is going to be its own really equation, right? It's going to be determined by some stuff. And when it's determined by stuff, what I mean is it's going to be determined by these other variables that are in this set or the system of linear equations. We got output, prices, money supply, interest rates, employment, and the wage rate. Right? So what I'm arguing here is basically, okay, current output is a function of lagged prices, lagged money supply, lagged interest, lagged unemployment, or lagged employment, not unemployment, and lagged wage rates. Prices, function of lagged output, lagged money, lagged interest rates, lagged employment, lagged wage rates, so on and so forth. All right, they're all functions of lags of each other. Now, this is an econometric model. This is like an econometric representation of one of these newer, better, fancier dynamic macro models, which we'll be looking at in a minute. But let's think about what happens if there's a shock to output, right? The first thing is, if there's a shock to output, how are we going to consider, what are we going to think of that as, right? Well, if we think about it in supply and demand space, right, or price output space, we get supply and demand. And if there's a change to Y, well, it's a change to output. We can think of that as a supply shock. So what happens when there's a supply shock? Well, in just like the demand-supply framework, what happens is the supply curve shifts out, right? We'll say that this shock to output is an increased output, although it's a linear it's a system of linear equations, so we could either increase it or decrease it, and the magnitudes of the responses would be the same. We just flip the signs around. But we'll assume it's a positive supply shock, right? Well, that means the supply curve, or the aggregate supply curve in this case, would shift along a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So output goes up, prices fall. So Y goes up, P falls. Now the interest rate's going to fall as a result, implying that monetary policy probably isn't going to respond very much because they generally don't respond that much when it comes to supply shocks, right? This new technology that led to the supply shock, right, that led to this increase in Y, and, we'll talk about the technology and the role that that plays and all that a little bit. Actually, later in this lecture, we'll talk about it for a minute. It means basically we can produce more stuff and we can do it more efficiently. Now, when we do that, we can increase more stuff, we can produce more stuff, we can do it more efficiently. Prices are falling. Well, okay, it means people are going to want more stuff. The only way we get people to get more stuff is if we get those same people to make more stuff. So labor is going to increase. But if firms need more workers, right, what happens to the wage rate? Well, it has to go up. Because if you need more of something, right, if you want more of something for whatever it is that you're doing, right, you're probably willing to pay a higher price. And that's what happens in labor markets, right? There's going to be an increase in the demand for labor, therefore the wage rate's going to go up. However, if we think of this as like an increase in the price level, well, we can think of that as a demand shock, right? It's an aggregate demand shock. Well, prices will go up in an aggregate demand shock because we have this downward sloping demand curve shifting along an upward sloping supply curve, right? Prices will rise, but output will also rise. So in a supply shock, output and price move in opposite directions. In a demand shock, on the other hand, output and price move in the same direction. And some of that, like economic theory, that we can sort of impose in this stuff a little bit later on. So if the central bank wants to keep interest rates relatively constant, they'll probably increase the money supply to try to lower the interest rate because this demand shock is going to lead to a raise or an increase in the interest rate, which is, further going to increase the price level and possibly output, maybe. And this would transmit to the labor markets by increasing demand for labor and increasing the wage rate. But chances are this won't be as large, nor will it be as long-lasting as the supply-side shock. And we'll get into why that is much, much later in the course. But yeah, it's definitely not as long-lasting. If there's a labor supply shock, right? So there's a shock to the labor markets. Let's say, okay, Trump's out of office and the build the wall thing is gone. Well, okay, cool. We get, more immigration into the United States. What does that mean for the labor force? It goes up. Right, if you remember that episode from South Park, they took our jobs. Basically, that's what happens. I mean, not quite in anywhere near as xenophobic a way as that, but there is going to be an increase in the labor force. Well, what happens if the labor force increases, right? If there's a supply shock of any sort, the quantity is going to increase, but the price for that is going to fall. So if the labor force, the quantity of labor supplied goes up, the wage rate's going to fall. Now, output's going to increase a little bit. It won't increase by anywhere near as much as if it were, say, a supply-side shock that's like a technology shock, right? The first shock that we looked at. But output will increase, and the price level is going to fall a little bit. And again, there's likely not to be much of a monetary policy response. I mean, there could be, depending on what their policy mandates are and things like that, but chances are there's not going to be that much of a monetary policy response, namely because monetary policy is more aimed at trying to affect more demand-side things than it is supply-side stuff. Okay, wow, so this, apparently you can only read about half of this right here. You can see from these three shocks, we get three totally different responses. Now, on top of all that, these Keynesian models that predated Lucas didn't include household preferences. And you're probably at first going like, okay, well, yeah, big whoop, who cares? But let's think about this for a minute. If we don't include households, What is the economy made of? It's made of households. Like literally, the entire economy is households. Now, these households demand things. They also supply labor, right? They supply capital. They invest. There's everything that's happening is happening within these households, right? Do you think anybody at, say Goldman Sachs just lives at Goldman Sachs? No, they have it's Goldman Sachs. They might actually live there. Let's think. Okay. Do you think anybody on the model risk management team at Western Alliance Bank, something that I probably do you think they live at the bank? They don't, especially now, with like COVID and all that. The economy is made up of households. So if we don't include households, you think we're really kind of missing out on some stuff here? I mean, I would say they are. Lucas did too. These models were emitting majorly important information about, what the responses to this model would be, right? It's what's known as like omitted variable bias. There's a huge problem with omitted variable bias. Labor supply decisions are guided by the household's preferences for consumption and leisure, right? How much do they like to consume? How much do they like to sit on their ass? Right? If you want to consume more and you value consuming things more than you value sitting on your ass, well, you're going to get up off your ass and you're going to go work, right? It's a labor supply decision that comes from the household, right? Aggregate demand is decided by the household's preferences for consumption and savings. If we don't include these, we don't get good results that could really have any meaning whatsoever. And the Lucas critique pointed that out. The Lucas critique said basically these models needed to have structure. They weren't, quote, deep. If we include things like households' preferences, then that's going to help deal with this major issue that we have. How do we do that? Well, we basically treat these models just like we treat microeconomic models, right? Lucas argued that these models need to be micro-founded or, quote, have micro-foundations. Ultimately, these models look just like microeconomic models. They're a little different because they're dynamic. We ultimately aggregate these models when we're done. But at the end of the day, there's a utility function. There's, firms' profit maximization. It's all economic theory that's derived from microeconomic theory. And after the Lucas critique, these models changed pretty much overnight. Eventually, and when I say eventually, really, I mean like not long after this. I think it was like within a couple of years. It was like 82, 83, something like that. The first dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE model, was born. Now, these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, these DSGE models, are dynamic because they incorporate changes over time. They address how a decision made today can affect outcomes tomorrow and how it can guide decisions tomorrow, right? If you make a decision to do something today, like let's say, okay, here's, dynamic example. I hope you're all 21 and above. And if you're not, just, cover your ears, I guess. But if you have the option to, either stay home and study for this class or go out and drink, and say there's an exam tomorrow, right? The decision you made today is going to affect what happens tomorrow. Well, that's a dynamic element here, right? If you chose to go out and drink, you're going to be really hungover, which isn't going to help your exam. And you're also not going to know anything, which is also not going to help your exam performance, right? But if you stayed home and studied, okay, maybe you don't get to go out and have fun and drink, but assuming you think drinking is fun, not everybody does. But you get a good grade, right? You have a higher probability of adequate exam performance. So these models act in a pretty similar way. I mean, they don't have examples with alcoholism and all that. They're not. Well, I don't know. They might be made by alcoholics. Who knows? Not saying I'm an alcoholic though, but there's a dynamic element to this. Now, they're stochastic because these models are subject to different types of shocks. Every shock is treated as like a draw from a predetermined distribution of shocks for each type of variable. These shocks would affect things like supply, they'd affect things like demand, etc. Right? So these shocks come from some sort of a distribution, and this distribution, follows some path over time. That's what's known as a stochastic process. So these models incorporate stochastic processes in them so that we can really have a source of shocks that we can look at these things with. Now, we've covered the D part and the S part. Now it's time for the GE part. And no, it's not General Electric. General equilibrium, because they include all markets, right? They will have labor markets, investment, capital markets, money markets, government spending, taxation, borrowing, other markets depending on the scope of the model. But they all look at how the equilibrium across all markets included in the model respond to these shocks. So basically, the models evolve over time. They're subject to stochastic shocks, and they evolve over time subject to stochastic shocks while covering a general equilibrium framework, right? So you've learned a lot of partial equilibrium. Supply of this, demand for that, that's it. But if you affect, something in, say, the market for, I don't know, if you affect something in the market for like, I'm looking around my desk at things right now. All right, if you screw with something in the market for guitars, it's probably going to affect the markets for guitar pickups or guitar strings, right? Those things are going to be related. That would be looking at more of a general equilibrium framework than it would just, what happens to guitars? And these models kind of look at it sort of from that perspective. They're looking at all markets over time that are subject to shocks. And they try to model these things. They try to calibrate these things in a way that very closely mimic the evolution of whatever economy they're trying to model, right? So if we're doing it in the U.S., these things would be calibrated. Certain parameters in the model would be calibrated. Certain distributions for the shocks would be calibrated to be consistent with the way that the United States economy has evolved over the last however long you want to look at it, right? Now, the models aren't really backwards looking. They're forward looking, which, kind of deals with some of the Lucas critique stuff, which is awesome. And so, yeah, these models are amazing. I swear by them. And they ended up becoming the workhorse models for really trying to understand the dynamics of macro and monetary economics. They're used by central banks all around the world to try to understand their economy, the global economy, right? Because if, the United States, they set their monetary policy, they'll set interest rates consistent with, where they want the U.S. to be. They don't really care what happens with the other economies when they set their policy. That doesn't mean they're not considering what's going to happen to these other economies, right? So there's a lot of like open economy DSGE models, right? There's, you could literally take entire courses on open economy DSGE models. And they're used to try to sort of like forecast or predict the effects of monetary policy changes. A better way to say it is they would be used to try to understand what the possible responses are to monetary policy shocks. The Fed uses these things so often. They actually have a ton of YouTube videos on them. And, the World Bank and the IMF have all sorts of like free courses that you can take. I'm actually enrolled in one right now on different types of DSGE models that you can learn to play around with in MATLAB and manipulate and, get all sorts of cool stuff out of that, right? There's a ton of stuff out there about these types of models. So enough of that for just right now. Time to talk about what the next section of the course will be delivering. So hit it, Johnny. I know it's lame. These models aren't different, well, very different from microeconomic models. They've got utility maximizing households. They've got cost minimizing or profit maximizing firms. Sometimes they include government, central banks, various sectors of production or finance. Other times they don't. But what's happening is they're all optimizing subject to a set of constraints. Households have dynamic budget constraints. Firms have either a constraint for producing at some fixed level, or they use their cost function as a constraint, depending on the type of optimization being used, right? Because cost minimization implies profit maximization. Profit maximization does not imply cost minimization. And when there's certain types of assumptions used in these models, sometimes it's okay to use cost minimization. Other times you have to use profit maximization. But we'll get into that when we get into some of these different types of models. But by including these assumptions into these macro models, we can now see how household preferences would play a role in determining, say, the interactions of demand and supply, or how they decide to supply labor to the firm given whatever the going wage rate is, right? We can actually, if we calibrate these models that are going to be consistent with some of the behavior that we've seen aggregated over time, then we can get a pretty good idea as to what's going on. Now, the model's not going to be perfect, right? All models are wrong. It's just that some models are useful. DSGE models happen to be more useful than a lot of the other macro models out there. So I've been ranting and raving about these things for probably, 20 minutes out of the last 35 I've been talking. 36 now. Let's see an example of what a dynamic macro model is. So the household's got a utility function, right? Now they maximize their utility of consumption over an infinite time horizon, right? So I've got this U equals a summation as t goes from 0 to infinity. T is time. And we've got this beta to the t. Now this beta is what's known as a discount factor. And it discounts your future choices relative to today. So if beta is, say, 0.9, right, tomorrow matters 90% of what it does to you today. Like today's worth 100%. Tomorrow is only 90% as important. And that goes on and on and on over time. Therefore, the further out in the future we look, the less we're worried about it now, right? Think about it where, I'm a certain age. You guys are probably 20, 21-ish, somewhere in that range. Are you worried about your retirement funds right now? Probably not. Right, you're probably a little bit more worried about, finishing school and trying to make sure that you can financially survive the rest of your schooling. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I don't know. I have no idea. But that's kind of what this beta is telling us, right? It's saying right now, we're not worried about retirement. Now, when we're in our 40s and 50s, we're going to start to worry a little bit more about our retirement funds, right? Our 401k is all of a sudden going to be a lot more of a topic of conversation. So we maximize this utility, and this utility is basically a function of consumption. And we do it with respect to these following, or not with subject to these following constraints. We got y equals c plus I. Does that look familiar to you? Have you seen anything that looks like that before? No? Maybe you have. I don't know, because I can't really interact with you guys in real time via these videos. That's GDP without government. So we're assuming there's no government here, right? It just says output has to be split by the sum of consumption and investment. It's what's known as a resource constraint. Now, I've got a constraint for investment, right? Investment is the flow of capital over time. And we'll get to what this stuff means later. But this KT plus 1 and KT are just capital. KT plus 1 is tomorrow's capital. KT is today's capital. So we're looking at the flow of capital over time, the difference between the capital that we get for tomorrow versus what we have today, less depreciation, which is that delta term. And again, don't freak out because, when I teach you some of these constraints and stuff, I'm going to walk you through every single step. Finally, we have output being a function of capital, F of KT. Oh, excuse me, sorry. These burps, I'm so rude today. And then I've got this A sub t in front. What is that? Well, that is the source of technology shocks. A technology shock basically shifts production up or down. If there's a positive technology shock, we can produce more with the same amount of capital as what we had before. And again, if you're going what the hell does that mean? You're going to see both graphical and math examples. I'm going to let you plug some numbers in, play with this stuff later. But just take my word for it, we'll have these constraints. Now, we've got one thing we want to maximize, and we've got three different equations as our constraints. And that's going to suck trying to deal with all of that. But we can actually combine all these three constraints into one constraint to make things a lot easier. And that gives us this, right? I substituted out y for that production function, and I substituted out I, investment, for the flow of capital over time. Right? And then I do a little bit of algebra, a little bit of calculus, take some derivatives, and I get a system of equations to describe the general equilibrium. These equations are, well, the first one is the Euler equation, which explains how the household either wants to consume or save over time. Probably going like, what is that? Don't worry, it's actually a lot easier to deal with than you'd think. Marginal utility of consumption today is equal to the discount factor times the marginal product of capital for tomorrow, right? Which we can think of as being like equal to 1 plus the interest rate. So it's really a balancing act, that beta and the 1 plus the interest rate. It's kind of a balancing act between what the market is going to reward us for saving and how much we don't want to save. And that's multiplied by the marginal utility of tomorrow's consumption. So it's a way to explain the flow of consumption over time. And if we're explaining the flow of consumption over time and we can either consume or save, well, if we're explaining one, right, deductive reasoning says we can figure out what the other is going to be. So that's how it explains the consumption savings path over time. And then, we have the equations for investment, production, the resource constraint, which you've seen those three already, right? Those are actually the constraints. But we also have the stochastic process that the technology shocks follow. So I got these four equations plus the Euler. So these four equations with the Euler equation will describe the general equilibrium of this particular dynamic macro model. Now, this is a really simple dynamic macro model. They get way more complicated, way more advanced. Don't worry, you're not going to be solving any of these really crazy advanced dynamic macro models because honestly, these constraints get really, really, really effing long. I don't want to make you deal with that stuff. It's more like rote math than it is anything else, and well, we can do better things than that in this course. So yeah, this is basically what a general equilibrium would look like because we're capturing movements within all the markets, right? We've got consumption and savings. We can sort of think of that almost as like an aggregate demand type thing, right? I've got investment, which is sort of going to help explain like what's going on with the savings. I've got this y equals f of kt. We can sort of think of that. It's like a production function. We can also sort of think of that as like an aggregate supply thing. The resource constraint, y equals c plus I, basically what that does is that forces supply and demand to be equal to each other. Aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. And then just that last equation, A equals this gamma thing times AT minus 1 plus epsilon T. That says that basically this shock, A, right, follows this process where it's determined by previous values plus a little bit of error, right? If you ever heard past behavior predicts future behavior, that's what this says. Past behavior predicts future behavior plus a little bit of error, right? And that error is really where the shock is going to come into play and transmit into the production function. But again, we'll get really into that stuff. Don't worry about it just yet. This is just an example of what it looks like. You don't have to solve this thing out. Honestly, you probably don't even have to take notes on this, and I probably should have said that 8 minutes ago. So the set of equations that's listed out gives us a general equilibrium, and it tells us how consumption, investment, output, technology shocks, all that stuff behave together. Thus, we have a general equilibrium, right? We've got all of these things moving together, and we can, like, the model is closed out, right? Everything is explained. All these markets are explained. Therefore, we have equilibrium in all of these markets. Now, if we wanted to add money markets, if we want to add government spending, financial markets, labor markets, etc., into the model, we totally can. It means more equations, but it also means a more complete story, right? Trade-offs here. Want to do a little bit more math to get a better story, or do you want to not do as much math but not have as complete of a story? Because the dynamic model I showed you didn't have labor markets in them. Well, these people work, right? Why the hell aren't there labor markets in there? Good question. Well, okay, let's see. There's a government.
Why the hell isn't government in there? Again, good question. What about money markets? We got money, right? This model right here, there's no money in there. There's not even a price in there. I mean, think about that for a second. There is literally no price in this model. Do you see a PT anywhere? Do you see an MT? No, neither do I. There's no prices in this model. Now, we'll get into why later. Basically, this model is solved out where we assume that we basically know what the quantity is. We know what the price is going to be that's going to clear everything out. So we really don't need prices because, well, it's optimal quantities are chosen. But the more complete our story gets, right, the more of this stuff we add in there, the more we can analyze how the economy is going to respond to shocks. Now, once we have these models, right, because, okay, these models can show how the economy behaves over time, really how the economy responds to shocks in a dynamic fashion. Great. That's awesome. What's the effing point of that? Why would we care if we can't test it, right? Because, you come up with a cool idea. It's great. It's a nice idea. You got to put it to the test, right? You got a hypothesis. That's nice, but you have to test the hypothesis. Well, fortunately, around the same time, there was a way to set up a set of linear equations and impose some sort of economic structure on them that really lets us test these DSGE models. And, we use some pretty cool estimation techniques to do it. Again, we'll talk about that later. The nice thing about this is these estimation techniques, one more second. Minor indigestion from salmon that I ate. It was good salmon, though. Anyways, wow, okay. ADD. Focus, Jeremy, focus. The cool thing about these, statistical models that we'll be learning about is you don't actually have to learn how to do any of them. Best part is I'm going to do them all for you. And I'm going to get these, basically I'm going to draw out the responses to certain shocks. And you're going to look at them and go, okay, hey, cool. This goes up, this goes down, this has to be a shock of, X type, right? You can identify monetary policy shocks. You can identify supply shocks, demand shocks, all sorts of cool shocks just by looking at how these little things respond over time. You get to look at pictures and just tell me what the picture says. I mean, does it get any cooler than that? I don't think so. So when it comes to this section of the course, let's talk about what we should expect from this. Because this stuff can seem scary. I can't say I can promise you won't be scared. I can tell you that I can promise you have no reason to be scared. So, now you're probably going oh boy, what the hell did he mean with that? Anyways, we're going to learn about how constraints work. First, we'll do static constraints, like what we see in, intermediate micro if you've taken that course. But then we'll kind of graduate. Because, micro is awesome. Micro is super important, but it's just a nice stepping stone to get to macro. Macro is more important. And we're going to deal with dynamic constraints, and we're going to learn about how to interpret these guys in a more intuitive way. We're going to learn about how household utility functions work. Right? We're going to learn sort of what they are, why they are what they are. We're going to combine them, and we're going to learn a little bit about dynamic optimization and why it matters. Right? Why would dynamic optimization be important? Well, to see why it's important, or to think about why it's important, we'll see, how monetary policy affects public finance, right? How does monetary policy affect the ability of the government to pay its debt? Well, okay, yeah, debt management. Pretty important stuff. We're going to talk about, and we're going to see how monetary policy affects labor markets, right? These dynamic models can provide answers to all these questions so far. You can see how it affects output and inflation. You can see how it affects financial markets, right? Because if we include all of these things and we have monetary policy shocks, we're going to see how it's going to transmit through certain markets to ultimately try to increase output and decrease unemployment, right? It's sort of like the end goal here. But there's different ways it can move, right? It can transmit through different mechanisms. And the more of this stuff we learn, the more of these transmission mechanisms we can learn about. And finally, we're going to learn about how monetary policy affects you. Yeah, I know. I had to put that in there. Actually, I didn't have to put that in there. In hindsight, I'm kind of wondering why I put that in there. It's kind of cheesy, isn't it? So to wrap up, we learned about the history of macro, sort of. Very, very brief history. We learned about the evolution of macro models since the 1930s. We saw why DSGE models are so useful and so damn important and what they look like, right? Now, here's what you won't have to do in this course. You won't have to do more than a couple of derivatives from time to time. You won't have to do more math than you know what to do with. You won't have to do second-order Taylor series expansions around a non-stochastic steady state, or any stochastics for that matter. Now, here's what you will have to do. Some math, a little bit of calculus, but mostly algebra. You're going to have to draw and interpret graphs. You're going to have to use some economic intuition to answer major macroeconomic questions, some of which don't really have a solid answer. So that's where the economic intuition really comes into play, right? How are you going to argue your case for some of these questions? And you're going to understand monetary policy and its key transmission mechanisms throughout the economy, and ultimately how monetary policy, which is a nominal variable, right? A nominal shock, how that can transmit to ultimately affect real economic variables. These are the things that you're going to have to do. These are the things that you're going to learn. And throughout the section of this course, and really throughout the remainder of this course, you will learn how to I will make sure you all know how to do these things. And hopefully it should be fun. So yeah, basically the next lecture is going to cover some stuff with constraints. We're going to have a few lectures on constraints. Then we're going to get to a little bit of optimization. I'm going to fly through the optimization because you're probably not going to have to do very much. But I do want you to see how it works, right? If I'm going to show you a car, teach you to drive the car, I want you to see at least how the car is built. So that way you understand what the hell's going on under the hood. It's kind of the way I'm going to approach this stuff. So we're going to see dynamic budget constraints, which you're going to play with a lot. Dynamic optimization, which you're not going to play with very much. And then we're going to basically try to look at the general equilibrium and go, okay, well, if a shock enters here, what's it going to do? How's it going to affect this? And it's going to be more qualitative than it's going to be quantitative, right? Just this goes up, this goes down. I'm not going to give you a ton of numbers or anything that you have to figure out how that stuff works. So yeah, I kind of rambled for a little bit. I know, sue me, so what? 50-something minute lecture, but I think these lectures are supposed to be like 75 minutes anyways. But if I manage to get what I think is important for one lecture done in less than 75 minutes, then wee. So with all that said, until next time, enjoy yourselves, and thank you for watching this far in. Oh, and don't get scared about the DSGE stuff. It won't be bad.